everybody, welcome back. It's another Whiteboard Wednesday. I'm so psyched for this topic this week, and we're looking at estrogen, the double-edged sword of estrogen in female health and autoimmune disease. There's a lot to cover here, but the order of events is going to be this. We're going to talk about low and high estrogen and the health consequences associated with that. We're going to talk about estrogen in autoimmunity, right? The good and bad of it, I would say. And then estrogen in mental health, and then estrogen in weight loss. I'm going to touch a little bit about that at the end because I think it would be helpful for all of you. So if we were to look at low estrogen first, this is something that you typically see within the fitness community, people who are over-exercising, chronic dieting, maybe doing competitions, and even athletes like marathon runners. And so maybe you've experienced symptoms like this, but they are fatigue, of course, hot flashes, low libido, sex drive, loss of a period, amenorrhea, irregular periods, oligomenorrhea, changes in your menstrual length, vaginal dryness, hair loss, night sweats is very common. And then you may have physical signs of, a pale complexion, dry eyes, and changes in your breast volume. And this is all really important because it puts you at risk for future long-term health complications like osteopenia, low bone density, right? Vaginal atrophy, premature ovarian failure, right? And then vasoconstriction, which is really an issue related to high blood pressure, heart problems. One of the things that we should understand is that the blood vessels, the endothelium in particular, is estrogen dependent. So if you are depleted in estrogen, it can increase blood pressure because it causes the blood vessels to constrict. And progesterone is just as important as estrogen, or dropping estrogen, because progesterone will help you with maintaining that balance, right? So we need progesterone in the right ratio with estrogen. And then, of course, many times women who are experiencing low estrogen will have a concomitant low progesterone as well from chronic dieting and stressing out and working out too much. And then you end up with anxiety and nervousness and insomnia and a brutal PMS period and maybe even mid-cycle spotting, right? So overall feeling worse towards the luteal phase of your menstrual cycle. Now conversely, we have estrogen dominance. This is probably typically more seen, and you probably identify with this more because the symptoms look like potentially weight gain, fibrocystic breasts, heavy periods, painful periods, dysmenorrhea, mood swings, irritability, headaches, and strong PMS. And so to be clear, when we're talking about estrogen dominance, we're speaking about a high estrogen relative to progesterone. Progesterone could be normal, but estrogen is still a little bit higher, or both hormones are low, yet estrogen is still a tad bit higher. Now, there are 4 predominant root causes for this that I've seen. And so the first one is xenoestrogens, okay? So exposure to estrogen mimicking substances in food, water, pesticides, plastics, hormones, right? So a high sugar, high fat diet can contribute to this. Animal products, dairy, meat, red meat that is, caffeine, alcohol, along with low fiber, okay? And deficiencies in maybe like sulfur. Nutrients that we need for phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification. Not to mention low exercise maybe, or especially hormonal birth control and hormone replacement therapy can all contribute to estrogen dominance. Now the second thing would be low progesterone, right? And what I mean by that is dieting, over-exercising, and stress can deplete progesterone and then subsequently put you at a estrogen dominant state. Thirdly, we have, this is probably the most common reason why, I think, poor breakdown of estrogen in the bowels and metabolism in the liver. So I think this is women's biggest issue, and the reason for this stems from, well, a number of things, but infections I see a lot, okay? Infections can cause this, cholestasis or poor bile flow, right? Moving from the liver into the gallbladder and dumping into the duodenum in the small intestine. Liver stagnation, fatty liver, stuff like that. Poor digestive function from stress, low stomach acid, pancreatic enzymes maybe dysautonomia, which is also from stress and past traumas and infections potentially. And then, oxidative stress as a whole from toxins and the environment can disrupt liver detoxification and perpetuate this problem even further, okay? And so lastly would be inflammation, right? So believe it or not, pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6, which is notorious, is capable of increasing aromatization, which is a fancy way of saying that we are converting testosterone and androgens into estrogen, okay? Our fat cells do this, but it happens all over the body. But inflammatory molecules can actually ramp this up. And studies show that estrogen is particularly increased in conditions like inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, right, and autoimmune disease. And that's at least partially a result from the pro-inflammatory nature of the disease. And they are able to stimulate this aromatase activity. So those are the four main reasons that I see for causing estrogen dominance. So what are the consequences of estrogen dominance? We know that there are a lot of issues that can stem from estrogen dominance, at least that being a part of it, right? Some of these you may be familiar with, right? Uterine fibroids, endometriosis, adenomyosis, fibrocystic breast issues, menstrual issues, of course, and then ovarian cysts, right? Something you hear a lot about right now, gets a lot of attention, especially in the PCOS world. Yet, ironically, not everyone who has multiple cysts has the typical characteristics of PCOS. And on the flip side, not everyone with PCOS has cysts. Here's the thing though, women have cysts, especially when you're younger, you have more than somebody who's an older woman, okay? They're not inherently bad, right? You're gonna have them, and that's fine. But the issue is that estrogen complications, estrogen dominance can drive this issue of cysts becoming enlarged, rupturing, and then needing to be removed because they cause so much pain. Now, when it comes to thyroid health, estrogen poses a threat to that as well. And sometimes it's an issue in Hashimoto's and other autoimmune conditions, which I'll get back to in a minute. But to quickly delineate this, estrogen dominance can cause a functional hypothyroidism, right? And basically what it's doing is it's inhibiting hormone absorption because it increases a protein, a hormone carrier protein, which is called thyroid binding globulin, which binds up thyroid hormone in greater amounts than we want. And it does this also with cortisol binding globulin, which too binds up cortisol. And because of that, you have less free cortisol to exert its effect on helping you adapt to stress. And that's an issue, right? So additionally though, estrogen can interfere with bile flow, and that's important for gut health and also decreasing your risk for SIBO. So estrogen can create an unfavorable change in your bowel motility potentially. It can impair liver detoxification, and it can cause water and salt retention, aka bloating and even constipation. So let's now look at estrogen and autoimmune disease. I used to think that estrogen was a real problem for autoimmune situations across the board, but it turns out that's not the case. As always, it just depends. So we're referring to how estrogen impacts the immune system specifically, either in a way that's helpful or unhelpful for your autoimmune disease. Now bear in mind though that aside from the sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone, your microbiome and external factors and triggers are all capable of impacting the immune response as well. So this is only one small, a piece of the puzzle, I would say, okay? So we should understand that hormones are two things. They are dimorphic and bimodal, meaning they have different effects based on whether you're a male or a female, okay? And they can be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. So women make estrogen much more than men do. I think we all know that. But that's one of the issues, the endogenous issues, that explains why autoimmune disease is predominantly found in women. Nearly 75%, literally 75% of all autoimmune cases are actually related to females. So women have higher antibody production than men do largely because of estrogen. It has a role there. Men are protective of autoimmune disease to a greater degree because of androgens. So they have, we have DHEA, we have testosterone, and we have DHT. And all of these obviously are higher in men than female, but they protect against antibodies, and they regulate antibody production. They regulate the T cells, block some cytokines, they regulate DNA methylation, and they promote immune tolerance. So that's why you don't see autoimmune disease so much in men compared to women. So you as a female may not have high amounts of this. You have a little bit of testosterone, but it's not enough to really make an impact. But you have progesterone, and that's your anti-autoimmune hormone because it's immunosuppressive, much like these androgens are for men, which is why correcting for low progesterone states is of utmost importance. So coming back to estrogen, right? Here's an example of what I mean by estrogen being bimodal. So low estrogen in the female body can push you into a pro-inflammatory state overall. But in the context of autoimmune disease, when it's high, it can be anti-inflammatory, especially in Th1 dominant autoimmune diseases. So research actually shows that increasing the level of estrogens, right, particularly via supplementation or estradiol use, may have an anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effect in Th1 dominant diseases. So most notably, it's MS, right, Hashimoto's, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease. But some people who have a greater tilt towards Th2 dominance, like lupus, like scleroderma, atopic disorders, eczema, asthma, allergies, they may find that estrogen worsens the condition because it amplifies antibody production and health becomes much worse. So it really just depends on the context of what disease you're dealing with, because estrogen can be really helpful or it can be harmful. So again, a disease that's based on Th2 dominance, right? A disease that's driven by this, estrogens are a problem, okay? While Th1 dominant diseases can be helped with estrogen, right? Now keep in mind also that it's kind of variable between what diseases are Th1 and Th2. Like, it's not that cut and dried based off what I just said. Some diseases could be the other way around and some could be both. So just keep that in the back of your head when you think about this stuff. And evidence shows that the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, menopausal status, all of which are characterized by different changes in the estrogens, right, significantly influence the course of autoimmune disease. So of course you want to weave in also birth control use, hormone replacement therapy, as that influences it as well. So depending on where you are in your life cycle, like, this is going to impact your susceptibility to autoimmune disease. And like we mentioned before, one of the causes for estrogen dominance is inflammation. So failing to get to the root causes of your autoimmune disease allows for these pro-inflammatory cytokines, like you may have heard of these guys: interleukin-1, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. Okay, and they increase the aromatization of testosterone into estrogen. Okay, and that can potentially feed the antibodies because estrogen binds to T cell receptors, right? Stimulates B cells. They differentiate into plasma cells, and then they start making all these antibodies, right? And that's how we think it happens. So coming back though to Th1 and Th2 autoimmunity, we need to understand that not all estrogens are created equal. Generally, it's the 4 and 16 hydroxy estrogens that are problematic. And the good estrogen would be the 2-hydroxy estrogen. Okay? That's the safer one. And research shows that Th1 dominant autoimmune diseases demonstrate a lower set of androgens, but a higher level of 4 and 16. right? And they also have a lower amount of the 2-hydroxy estrogens. So one study, though, looking at lupus, the aromatase activity was inversely correlated with disease activity. So increased estrogen and low androgens had a worsening of health parameters in lupus. Women have 3 main estrogens that we're going to look at here briefly. So we have estrone. You've probably heard these before, right? E1, estradiol, E2, and then estriol, E3, okay? E1 and E2 are the primary estrogens in the body. And so 16, like I talked about before, 16-hydroxy estrogen comes from this guy, okay? And 4-hydroxy estrogen comes from this guy. So when they're broken down and metabolized, they can split off into that, okay? So E1 and E2 are primarily made in the liver, but they undergo metabolism by CYP450 enzymes, in case you want to know that. So here we're looking at the different estrogen metabolites that break down from estradiol in the liver, mediated by these cytochrome P450 enzymes right here. So we talked about how 4-hydroxy estrogen is bad, right? Like 16 is, and then the 2 is good, right? Well, there's a dark side to everything. And so the reason why I'm saying that is because 4-hydroxy estrogen and 2-hydroxy estrogen can break down into these carcinogenic molecules that damage DNA and cause oxidative stress, known as quinones. All right, so how do you countervail this? Well, one of the ways you can do that is by supporting this enzyme known as catechol-methyltransferase, COMT, as you may have heard of before. And this is a phase 2 liver detoxification enzyme that inactivates the 4-OH and the 2-OH. And that's a good thing because that means you can convert that into 2-methyloxy estradiol and the 4-methoxy estradiol. And both of these are good. Protective against tumors, cardioprotective, apoptotic activity against tumors, so it causes them to die. And then there's a lower binding affinity of this of this hormone as well, which means that it maybe won't exert, damaging, detrimental effects on your cells. And then the 4 does the same sort of thing, prevents oxidative metabolism of these estrogens and prevents DNA damage. A lot of doctors and people, and maybe even you, get caught up on these genes, COMT and THFR, right? To see if there are any genetic variants or polymorphisms or SNPs, some people call them, to see if you are at risk for, breast cancer and other estrogen-dependent cancers. And so there's actually been a lot of debate on whether or not that's true. And even with these cytochrome P450 enzymes, 1A1 and 1B1, right? And the research actually shows that SNPs, like maybe with this gene, COMT, if there's a slower activity of this enzyme, it may increase, obviously, the risk of quinone-induced DNA damage and oxidative stress. Right? Makes sense, but that research is really inconclusive, right? SNPs, even with these liver enzymes up here, are linked to breast cancer, but the findings are really mixed. So it appears to be that there really is not enough sufficient data to suggest that these pro-cancer, right, metabolites like 4-OH and the 16-OH are predictors of breast cancer. The 2-hydroxy estrogen appears to be more favorable and less harmful than the 4 and 16 because they exhibit anti-cancer effects, all these things basically I listed off earlier. And decreases the purportedly pro-cancer 4 and 16 hydroxy estrogen. So you really want to have a healthy 2 to 16 ratio, as a lot of experts and researchers have elucidated. So you can check your 4, 16, 2 levels through a Dutch test. That is something that a lot of people do, not something that I do personally, but you can do that to see where your levels are. So there are other noteworthy interventions that you can do to help with this 2 to 16 ratio that you want to have, right? And so we have things like, so for supporting the 2 to 16 ratio, we have things like calcium, calcium D-glutarate, right? So calcium D-glutarate is something that's really helpful for inhibiting an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, which in turn helps enhance detoxification of estrogens and toxins overall to get them into the stool, and out they go. We have DIM, I'm sure you've heard that before, diethylmethane, and it's a favorite for me actually because it helps with converting estrogens into 2-hydroxy estrogen. Okay? DIM also indirectly helps with bile flow from the gallbladder, which you want to have because bile is what helps you remove estrogen and gets it into the stool. Okay? Too much estrogen can actually cause cholestasis and block bile flow as well. And then lastly, DIM is a really good inhibitor of the aromatase activity like we talked about before from converting testosterone into estrogen. So DIM can actually prevent that from happening. There's another one that I like to use called Myomin. It might be a little bit better than DIM actually. And Myomin is basically good for 2 real reasons. It helps because it reduces this aromatization we talked about, and it actually blocks estrogen receptors, right? Basically, it competes with estrogen at these receptor sites, so it doesn't causes its havoc. So it also does help with increasing this ratio naturally, and it's good for fibrocystic breasts and fibroids and endometriosis. I really like to use it for that as well, and even PCOS. And then yeah, there's obviously exercise that will help with the ratio as well. We know that, I think. Resveratrol is a good one. What else? Flax, right? So fiber, obviously, to bind to estrogen, flaxseed is a good one. And then cruciferous veggies. Probably the best thing you can do daily is eat your kale, your broccoli, your Brussels sprouts, those things. So quick word here on endocrine disruptors because the environment has a role, like we talked about before, in increasing estrogen dominance. So xenoestrogens are a really popular issue. So BPA is one of these xenoestrogens that we know has estrogenic-like functions that alter T cells. They increase B cell function, which increases antibodies, dendritic cell activity, and really it can cause abnormal immune communication. So in the context of Hashimoto's, we know BPA is a big problem, and BPA levels are actually correlated with increased TPO antibodies in people with Hashimoto's. The research has shown that. Exposure to xenoestrogens as a whole, whether it's phthalates or dioxins as well, things that are in your personal care products, they act as estrogens and they block the binding of your own estrogen, right? And so this can really promote a lot of issues, cause aberrant gene expression, promote inflammation, increase antibody production, and so that's why we always want to try to reduce our exposure as best as possible to these environmental estrogens. So because May is Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to do my due diligence here and share a little bit about estrogen and its role in the context of mental health, namely anxiety and depression, which are 2 prevalent conditions that we see in our society, wouldn't you say? And so if we look a little bit closely, we can see how estrogen can either help with this or even worsen it a little bit, hence the double-edged sword aspect of estrogen. So there's a lot to this, half of which I don't even know, but there are some things that I can impart to you. So estrogen does a couple of amazing things, and one of them is to, it sensitizes dopamine receptors, serotonin receptors, progesterone receptors, so that these neurotransmitters and hormones work better. It increases a neurotransmitter called gamma-butyric acid. In other words, GABA, G-A-B-A, which I'm sure you've heard of before. And this is a beautiful one because it helps with reducing anxiety and irritability and allows you to feel calm. But in order for GABA to work, it needs enough progesterone because progesterone sensitizes GABA receptors on the neurons. That's why during PMS, you feel moody and irritable and want to chop someone's head off, right? So progesterone tends to be too low for women during their period, during their luteal phase. And so lack of GABA can cause anxiety as low progesterone actually can cause anxiety as well from estrogen dominance. Estrogen is like your own antidepressant. It works really well when it works in tandem with progesterone and helping with mood. But too much is not a good thing either. Like I mentioned before, estrogen can increase cortisol binding globulin and make it harder to adapt to stress and make you really just feel on edge. Right? We talked about the COMT enzyme, right? Okay, and so one of the things that estrogen does, it's able to change the genetic expression of this gene, particularly contributing to a lower activity of the enzyme. So dopamine, one of the things that this does too is it breaks down dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So if it's got slower activity naturally, dopamine is going to linger, and so is adrenaline. And if you have too much of those catecholamines floating around, it can put you in a state of anxiety, angst, restlessness. It just interfere with your ability to think and function. So while progesterone and SSRIs and benzodiazepines are all helpful psychotropics with mood disorders, they are still band-aids because they artificially restore hormone levels or neurotransmitter levels maybe, right, and mask the central root issues that are causing these imbalances. And much like I said in the beginning of this video, your endothelium in your blood vessels have receptors for progesterone and estrogen, okay? So if you have enough progesterone, it's going to activate your GABA receptors, it's going to cause vasodilation, so your blood vessels expand, and you have adequate flow, and you're not at risk for high blood pressure, right? Conversely, if you have estrogen dominance and low progesterone, that could contribute to vasoconstriction, which isn't a good thing because it means you could be at risk for high blood pressure and other complications. It's not that cut and dry, but I'm just letting you know that these hormones have a role beyond just mental health too, but also in your cardiovascular system. And lastly, we're looking at estrogen in the context of weight loss, which I know is going to appeal to you. So if you're looking at how your hormones can affect your weight loss, well, here it is. So for the sake of simplicity, women have about 9 times more of these receptors known as alpha adrenergic receptors, which really abound in your hips and your thighs and your butt, okay? These receptors are really sensitive to, you guessed it, estrogen, okay? And when they're exposed to a lot of estrogen, they basically become overactive. Just like how insulin does, but I'll get to that in a minute. But basically you have alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, and they respond to adrenaline. And when they bind to the alpha receptor, when adrenaline binds to the receptor, it slows fatty acid release from the fat cell, right? And when they bind to the beta receptor, they speed it up. Fatty acids come out. So estrogen dominance increases the quantity of these alpha receptors. The quantity. That's an issue because if there are more alpha receptors because of too much estrogen, then they will bind to them. The adrenaline and the other catecholamines will bind to them and decrease their fat release, right? Think about it as if you were in a car, right? And you're shifting from like 5th gear, full speed, or 6th gear into 2nd gear, right? It's not as simple as that, but estrogen definitely can have a role in this weight loss problem that you might be experiencing. And then insulin is involved just as much as cortisol is. The thing with insulin is that it activates the alpha receptors, right? And even low estrogen states is not good either because they can make the alpha receptors work better, right? Which is not anything you really want. So overall, your mission is to decrease alpha receptor activity and density and manage your insulin levels and avoid insulin resistance and control your stress and reduce your environmental xenoestrogen exposure and improve your metabolism of estrogen in the liver and breakdown and clearance of estrogens in your gut. That will help you with not just weight loss, but with your overall health and everything else we talked about in this video. All right, my friends, that wraps up today's Whiteboard Wednesday. I hope that was exciting. Hope it was valuable and you got something out of it. And if you have any questions about it, feel free to slide into my DMs. Always here to help you. And I will see you next time. Take care, guys.